Go for it. All right, here we go. We left off with Maryland. So we talked about colonial Virginia. There's one thing that I don't typically, I understand like learning colonial America chronologically, but it's a little bit challenging because if I were to teach colonial America chronologically, I would go all over the map. I would be here, and then I would go up to Plymouth. I would go from Virginia to Plymouth, and then back down to Maryland, and then back up to Massachusetts. So I feel like it makes more sense to do it in a regional aspect. So that's why we're going Virginia, Maryland, Carolinas, Georgia. So it's intentional. It's not random because I think it's easier for us to kind of understand this sort of geographically. We'll deal with the South at the end of this lesson, and then we move into lesson 3. We'll deal with New England and the Middle Atlantic. So Maryland is not the second colony established. It'll be established after the Plymouth colony, and it's established like right after the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts Bay colony. So technically, it's like the fourth permanent colonial attempt for the English. The king of England at the time is James I's son, Charles I, who's not a popular king at all. He's kind of stuck between a lot of opposing forces. And one of the reasons for this is he's married to a Catholic, Henrietta Maria of France, and he is supportive of Catholics in England. And some of his close friends are tied to some powerful Catholics who want to try to establish a colonial venture for religious freedom for Catholics in America. And the guy that is going to lead the charge here is Lord Baltimore, George Calvert. This all starts in the process started in the early 1630s, around the same time that Puritans are going to go on to establish Massachusetts Bay. Well, George Calvert doesn't live to see the enterprise be carried out. His son, Cecilius Calvert, or Cecil Calvert, will not only inherit his title, Lord Baltimore, but he will also inherit the enterprise. The way that Cecil Calvert saw this was kind of like a feudal society, right? He was going to hook up his relatives and Catholic friends of nobility with large land grants, and then in turn, they were going to bring what over for them or with them for labor. Not yet. Indentured servants. They were going to bring over indentured servants, and they were going to kind of rule this feudal society in Maryland. But here's the problem. Most of these indentured servants are not Catholic. They are what? Protestant. Very good. So, and overwhelmingly Anglican. So you've got a lot of division politically, economically, as well as religious here early on. So it's founded, obviously on the basis of a similar economic system to Virginia. They're going to prosper in the growth of tobacco, though they're not going to be on the level of Virginia. There's still, how many people have been to Maryland? All right, a lot of you. There's a decent chance that when you were in Maryland, you were like anywhere from 30 to 50 miles from the Chesapeake Bay watershed or the Chesapeake Bay. So it was actually a really great place to grow tobacco. They also focused on timber as well as the fur trade. All right. Initially, what they're going to do is establish this commercial port known as Baltimore Town, better known to us now as just Baltimore. All right. And it's named for the Calverts. This will ultimately become their lead commercial port city and trade center moving goods in and out of the colony. All right. Their main labor force in the early years of Maryland was indentured servitude, but as time moves forward, similarly with Virginia, by the mid to late 1600s, we start to see the arrival of initially Africans that were put on indentures, but then by the late 1600s, Maryland will also move to a society of chattel slavery. All right. Interesting sort of turn of events, because by the mid 1600s, just within the first 10 years of the establishment of Maryland, a lot of Anglicans are settling there, as well as other Protestant groups. And the numbers are rivaling that of the Catholics that are coming over. So an act of religious toleration is passed in 1649, which was one of the first of its kind in the British colonies. This guaranteed religious freedom for all Christians in the colony. However, it decreed a death sentence to anyone who did not believe in the divinity of Christ. So this was a very difficult place for Jewish settlers or atheists or even some other sort of like more radical fringe Protestant groups to settle. Like, for example, there's one group that had a really hard time settling here, so they end up going after a land grant in Pennsylvania. Does anybody know what that religious group is? Ooh, that's good, but that's later.
The guess, is it the Quakers?
It's the Quakers. Good. These were good guesses every year, but it's the Quakers. Those groups are going to come on the scene later, and I'm going to teach you about those. Those are going to be like those are going to be in the Second Great Awakening later on. It's the Quakers. Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to talk about that in lesson 3. Because that was one of their, like, wheat and oats and grain was like one of their main cash crops. Quaker Pennsylvania was considered the breadbasket of colonial America.
So who's the guy with that?
It's kind of like fashioned after William Penn, who was the founder of the colony, but it's not exactly. I mean, that comes later. I'm actually going to get into that when we get to lesson 3. Okay, so that's a little bit about Maryland. On the top left, we have George Calvert. On the top right, Cecilius Calvert. If you've ever been bouncing around Baltimore, there's a pretty decent chance you've seen a statue of these two. They're in the city. Yeah, you're good. Anybody that's going to take off, do your thing. This probably looks familiar. Do we know what that is in the middle? That's Maryland's state flag. A lot of people wonder, like, why did Maryland adopt this flag? Like, what's the historical significance? It's the coat of arms for Lord Baltimore. That's why they adopted it. So, little piece of history there in terms of the origin of Maryland's state flag. On the left is an early map of Maryland, but on the right, I often like to point out to students a very interesting event that occurs toward the end of the colonial period. So after Pennsylvania gets their charter, obviously Virginia's had theirs, Maryland has theirs. There's a lot of dispute on the boundary of where Maryland and Virginia end and Maryland and Pennsylvania end. Like, what do those boundaries really look like? So a couple of surveyors ended up being hired to figure this out, and those surveyors were Mason and Dixon. So often when we're going north and we cross the Mason and Dixon line, we associate Mason and Dixon with the American Civil War. They have absolutely nothing to do with that. It's just the boundaries that were drawn to basically parcel Maryland and Pennsylvania by these surveyors, which I find kind of interesting and worth bringing up. So now we're going to move to the Carolinas. All right, little bit of prior knowledge coming your way, little backstory that I'm sure everybody might remember a little bit about, okay? So, as I mentioned before, Charles I is stuck in a very difficult scenario. He's not a popular king. He's not respected by the Anglicans, at least many of the Anglicans, because of his support for the Catholics. There's also a splinter group that is broken from the Anglicans known as the Puritans. Have you heard of these people before? Yes? And he's also not the most honest guy, and he's got problems with Parliament as well. This is all going to reach a fever pitch when Oliver Cromwell, who was a supporter and leader in the Puritan faction, and some members of Parliament decide to topple the crown. Does this sound familiar? And they end up taking off Charles I's head, right? This starts the English Civil War, which is like a 4-year war. We've heard about this before, yes? Okay? And this will lead to a 10-year rule by Oliver Cromwell. Well, then, what we see happen in this period of time between 1641 and 1651 is sort of like a little bit of an interruption in American colonization. But that interruption, guys, is up here. It does not interrupt colonization in the Caribbean. For example, in this period of time, England gets its most profitable colony out of the Caribbean from Spain. Does anybody know what that colony is?
Is it Cuba?
Cuba's a good guess, but no.
What's
A J.
Oh, Jamaica.
It's Jamaica. Very good. So it's not like they're totally out of the colonial scene, but they're not really expanding the colonies here. It won't be until the death of Cromwell and the restoration of the crown under King Charles II. And I'm sure you heard that whole story. Remember, he had Cromwell's body dug back up and they hang him. They hang his dead body. He goes, I'm seeing some head shaking, yes. Seeing some head shaking, yes. I don't know what was accomplished here, but that's what happened. Charles II is the son of Charles I, grandson of James I. He wants to get the colonial train back on the tracks. However, this is like a two-pronged solution for him. On the one side, you're getting the colonial era going again and the Americas, but number two, the restoration was expensive, so in order to pay off your debts, you can give your noblemen who supported you what? Land. You can give them land. It is absolutely bonkers what happens during the reign of Charles II. All of this here in the Carolinas and pretty much all of the Middle Atlantic is going to be colonized during his reign after the Restoration. We'll be talking about the Middle Atlantic stuff later. The nobility that receive these land grants are mainly focused on colonizing and developing what part of the Carolinas? What part of the land of the Carolinas? The coast. Okay? Good. It's all about the coast. So that is what's going to lead to the establishment of the coastal port city of Charleston, known then as Charlestown. How many people have visited Charleston, South Carolina? Beautiful city, right? Great food, good people, good vibes, beaches, all the things. But this was like a trade empire in the South for these aristocrats. This is also a pivotal moment for the movement from indentured servitude towards slavery. Because when the Carolinas are developed, a lot of the people that are going to lead the Carolinas are brought up from Barbados. And with them come African slaves. And with them and those slaves come the slave codes and the Barbados codes. So the real two big events that move colonial America away from indentured servitude and toward African chattel slavery is going to be the colonization of the Carolinas and Bacon's Rebellion. Those are two pivotal moments in colonial America that move them in that direction. So natives are also going to be enslaved, but not enslaved in the Carolinas. They're going to be part of the transatlantic slave trade, sold into slavery in the Caribbean and in New England. The Cusabo, the Creek, and other tribes in the region are captured and sold into slavery. Tobacco, rice, indigo emerge as principal cash crops. Large-scale plantations with African slaves are developed to cultivate all of these crops, notably rice and indigo. The farther you move up into the Carolinas, into what is now North Carolina, would have been more focused on tobacco due to the soil and the climate. Despite the violence with the Spanish in the region, Carolina proved to be too strong, but also too large to be toppled. So that's going to take us into why the Carolinas are split up. This crew is one of the oldest maps created of the Carolinas. It's by John Speed. He was a British cartographer. But if we really are trying to get a good idea of what this map looks like, it'd be better for us to rotate the map this way. And if we rotated it this way, we have Roanoke, we have Hatteras, we have the North Carolina coast, we have the South Carolina coast. And then you see into the distance, Appalachia. Does that make sense? It'd be a little bit better if it were rotated. All right. It'd be a little, it's like a horizontal view of the Carolina coast as opposed to a more vertical view that we're more accustomed to. Comments, questions, concerns? Yeah.
Are we going to go over pictures on the side?
Yeah, so the top left is Charles II, like toward the end of his days. The top center is like what a colonial dwelling would have looked like during this period of time. That top right one is actually connected to what you brought up, because what a lot of these common people are doing is growing their own cotton and spinning their own thread to make their own clothing. That's a reenactment. The bottom left is none other than Blackbeard. The bottom center, that's a cypress swamp, which would have also been a really great location to grow rice. And then on the bottom right are a group of reenactors that I'm going to talk about, known as the Carolina Regulators, which I'll talk a little bit about as we move forward. Good question. Okay, so North and South split. Okay, what had the Carolinas previously been part of before? What colony? What colony had the Carolinas previously been part of? Don't overthink this. To the north. Virginia. Okay? The Carolinas had been part of Virginia, at least a portion of it, right? So a big problem here is that especially in North Carolina, there were a lot of squatters. What are squatters? These are people that own no land, but they move into a territory and they settle on land that has not been claimed. All right? Pretty simple. But once the Carolinas are parceled out and these royal governors start to expand and they get in deeper into the Carolinas, they're like, what are you all doing here? We live here. What are you doing here? We own this. Oh, really? No, you don't. I lived in Virginia. I was an indentured servant. This is my land. No, it's not. I have the contract. You can see where the problem, unravel a lot of people here. This is going to lead to a major conflict, especially in North Carolina, between the settlers there and the government. The settlers, the common settlers of North Carolina absolutely despise the royal government that was based in initially Charleston, and then ultimately once the colony is divided, the colony's North Carolina's capital will be in New Bern, North Carolina, not far from Wilmington. Okay? So you really start to experience two flavors of the Carolinas. The South is focused on, these wealthy aristocrats are focused on cash crops and chattel slavery and a trade empire based out of Charleston, whereas the North Carolinians are these strong-willed, independent-minded, former indentured servants, not all but many, English, Scots-Irish settlers who are working on tobacco farms. They are skilled artisans, they're lumberjacks, they're subsistence farmers that are against the authority of the crown. Okay? This actually ends up really coming to a head in 1711 when a local tribe in the region is going to battle it out with the settlers. They're called the Tuscarora. And once the settlers defeat them, the Tuscarora that were not captured, killed, or enslaved, or sold into slavery, they actually end up going north to become the Sixth Nation of the Iroquois. All right? But what really angered the common militia force during this fight was that they didn't feel like they had support from the crown. And this is going to lead to a bit of a tense relationship between English and Scots-Irish settlers all the way to the dawn of the Revolution. This is what's going to ultimately lead to the North Carolina Regulator Movement. Has anyone ever heard of the book series or the show Outlander before? They dedicated an entire season to that Regulator Movement. Okay? So, by 1712, the Carolinas are officially split. But guys, you can see why. Look, this is a massive colony, right? And then you got the dispute of what is now Tennessee, because numerous people were trying to lay claim to Tennessee. So it was inevitable that a colony of this size was ultimately going to get parceled and divided into two. Any questions about the Carolinas up to this point? How am I doing over there? Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so these are old lithograph sketches. This is an early fort that was built to defend Charleston against attack. Please don't confuse this, though. That is not Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was not built until after the War of 1812. This was a completely different fort built to defend Charleston. This bottom image is Charleston Harbor. That's what gave Blackbeard all of his fame and notoriety, because he laid siege to the entire city and established a blockade, which is pretty wild. Okay, Georgia is our last, chronologically, it's our last colony established of the 13 in colonial America. Georgia was established for two major reasons. One, to provide a military buffer against Spain, and two, it was developed as a place for debtors to go. All right? The guy that led it is arguably one of the most open-minded or forward-thinking leaders in the colonial period. His name is James Oglethorpe. He was a military leader, but he was also a philanthropist. He called the colony the Charity Colony, and it will be named for King George II. So here are the things that Georgia have going for them. They established their settlement and capital in Savannah. Anybody ever been to Savannah? Absolutely beautiful place, right? Very charming. They are going to establish military fortifications. They are going to put debtors and indentured servants to work. Oglethorpe was against the institution of slavery, and he was also for religious freedom. That is why John Wesley, founder of the Methodist faith, will come over as a missionary to the Georgia colony. Any college named like Virginia Wesleyan, North Carolina Wesleyan, we've all heard of these before. That is named in honor of John Wesley. Georgia, tragically though, once Oglethorpe is done with the enterprise and it becomes a full-scale royal colony, they will move to chattel slavery, and Savannah will become one of the largest hubs for the transatlantic slave trade. Very tragic. All right. So we have Oglethorpe on the left. We have the early image of the settlement of Savannah on the right. And then this is where we wrap up the African-European slave trade. So how does this start? Well, there are some powerful West African empires that are in the midst of the slave trade. Ghana, Mali, Songhai, on the Gold Coast or the Slave Coast. Remember, they're not enslaving their own people. They are enslaving enemies in the interior from places like Angola, Sierra Leone, and the Congo. The first European group that gets involved in the slave trade will be the Portuguese. They're actually going to end up establishing basically a chain of islands known as the Madeira Islands, as not only a hub to produce sugar, but also a hub to trade slaves. All right? Everybody was in the mix of trading human cargo in this era. Arabs, Africans, Europeans. And not everybody did it the same way. Some people traded their slaves and put them on indentures. Some of them traded slaves and had them in a chattel situation where they and their offspring were owned for life. All right? But once the age of exploration really takes off, everybody gets involved and follows Portugal's lead. Spain in the early 1500s, the Dutch by the end of by the early 1600s, England, France by the early to mid 1600s. Everybody's getting involved in this process. All right. We also have to keep in mind that the death rate of the natives due to smallpox and warfare is also going to lead to Africans being brought over to fill the labor void. I had somebody ask a really good question. When does this all kind of happen? It really starts to ramp up around 1518, 1519, and then it just never stops, okay? To control slaves, all of these countries in America, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the British, everybody that was involved in the slave trade or the use of slaves instituted what were called slave codes. We often see these called Barbados codes, and they were most especially used in the system of chattel slavery. It is estimated that 10 to 12 million African slaves were brought to the Americas. Now, it's interesting because the actual least amount of slaves by population in that estimate actually wound up in the British American colonies in the 13. That was the smaller group. Does anybody know where the largest group wound up?
Who's the Caribbean, right?
That's a large group. A large group does wind up in the Caribbean, but it's estimated the largest group wound up, think Portugal here, Brazil, okay? It doesn't matter where they ended up, it's horrible, right? All right, so the area in which slaves were held was known as the Middle Passage, the part of the ship where slaves were held. Top right is a group of captured slaves. It's a lithograph of captured slaves in the interior of Africa being sent to the West Coast for sale. The bottom right, okay, thank you. The bottom right is our triangular trade route, which is like slaves and finished products coming out of the Gold Coast to the Caribbean, natural resources coming out of the Americas to Europe, finished products, and other materials going back to Africa. So something for us to think about is that both the Middle Passage and the triangular trade are sort of intertwined together, all right? Olaudah Equiano, very, very interesting individual. He was captured and sold into slavery in West Africa. He ultimately bought his freedom, and he wrote the most detailed account, one of the most detailed accounts, if not the most detailed account that we have about his experience, not only as a slave, but also his experience in the Middle Passage. Obviously, we have first, hand accounts of what life was like under the system of slavery, but we don't have quite as many about the Middle Passage because most of our slaves were not literate. All right? So we'll talk more about Equiano as we move forward. Any questions up to this point? Okay, cool. All right. So